Right here in the UK, I found a perfect partner to talk to about shoes. You might know her from the documentary The True Cost. You might have read one of her books, and if you haven't, you really, really should. I'm here with the author of Footwork, What Your Shoes Are Doing to the World, Tansy Hoskins. Welcome. It's so nice to meet you here in London. Let's just dive right into it. When we talk about what is wrong with the textile sector, the garment industry in general, we usually talk about clothing, and we recall the collapse of the Rana Plaza complex factory. So why, in your opinion, is it important? Why have you written this book, and why is it important to also talk about shoes?
No, that's a great question. And first of all, thank you so much for coming all the way to South London to talk about the global footwear industry with me. You're totally right. We've got to talk about shoes. Most of the time we talk about clothes and then we stop at our ankles and we forget to talk about what's on our feet. But the fact of the matter is that we cannot forget about our shoes. In 2019, every single day, we made 66.6 million pairs of shoes. You know, over 24 billion pairs in a year, which is crazy. So there's extreme consequences both of producing this amount of shoes and consuming this amount of shoes.
Mm-hmm. But I've talked about Rana Plaza a little bit. Has something changed since that event took place? That's 2013. So a lot of people died in the garments industry, and your work and also my work a bit got more traction. Has that changed something in the shoe industry as well?
I think if we take a snapshot of the shoe industry today, it is at least 10 years behind the rest of the fashion industry in terms of workers' rights, in terms of environmental consequences, and in terms of transparency. So no, I don't think Rana Plaza had a proper impact on the footwear industry. But obviously at the same time, you know, neither you nor me nor anybody wants to wait until something like Rana Plaza happens in the shoe industry before we start paying attention.
So let's dive into your book. You've visited factories in Macedonia. You've had calls with home workers from Pakistan. You visited other places. Maybe you could just start by describing what you've seen in Macedonia, why you've been to that place, and how you ended up there.
Yeah, well, like I went there. It's a really interesting place. So Eastern Europe has like a small, I mean small compared to China or Vietnam, but small but significant footwear industry. And obviously, you know, like you're talking about factories that were once part of like the former Yugoslavia and that have now been privatized and are often owned by like foreign investors. A lot of Italian investors, for example, own these factories. And the conditions are really, really bad. So the key factory that I visited in Macedonia, you know, it was up on like the second floor, but quite high up on the second floor, and there was no fire escape that I could see. You just had a long, thin room with all of these women working around this conveyor belt, and some of the women were using naked flames. They were using candles to singe parts of the shoes, next to which were pots of glue, like incredibly flammable glue. And you know, and if something, you know, were to happen in this factory, these women would have to, you know, jump out of the second floor windows, you know, as we've seen with other garment factory fires that have happened. You know, and the wages are very poor, the hours are poor. It's kind of seasonal work, so you don't get a year-round contract. And I also think it's interesting because that's like right here in Europe. You know, this isn't something happening like over there in Bangladesh or China or something. It's right here, and it's, you know, and they're being employed essentially by Italian companies and, you know, French companies, British companies.
Yeah, it's good that you mentioned the Italian companies, because when you were there, you saw boxes of shoes that didn't have made in Northern Macedonia on them, but made in Italy.
Yeah.
How come, and why is that so problematic? Because that's one of the issues that you do.
Yeah, that was a really weird moment. Like, you're looking at shoes, you're looking at like shoe boxes, and they've got printed on them really clearly, like made in Italy. But like, you're not in Italy, you're in Macedonia, and it's like it's a loophole basically in like European legislation called, what's it called? It's the Outward Processing Trade Directive or something like that. Which was basically established by German and Italian governments to protect their big businesses. And what it basically means is you can send the component parts of shoes, or you can have the component parts of shoes made in other European countries, basically have them made there and then have them shipped back to Germany or Italy or France or wherever, and then do one last bit of the shoe. So maybe you polish them in Italy, or maybe you put them in the box, you know, and like, so you speak to factory owners in Macedonia and they're just like, you know, yeah, like made in Italy does not mean made in Italy. And it's depressing as well, because it means, like, you know, that these factories and these workers in countries like Macedonia can't have their own like shoe industry, because we have got this warped idea that made in Italy is somehow superior to like made in Macedonia, you know, based on like old prejudices and stuff. So it's just another way that like the garment industry, the footwear industry is really unfair.
Yeah. Promoting inequality just right on the doorstep, actually.
Yeah.
So you've mentioned the glues, you mentioned that they're flammable, but another part of your book describes that it's also very, very toxic, and you speak to health professionals about that. Have you been in these places where you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, Sarah, like, if you like it's like one of my strongest memories about writing that book is the smell of glue, and like going into factories and then like having a headache within like 10 minutes, and then knowing that what you are breathing in is potentially a neurotoxin. You know, so something that is scientifically proven to be carcinogenic, so to cause cancer, to cause headaches, to cause fatigue, you know, to cause depression, all of these things, and that there's so little regulation, and this is happening all around the world. So not just factories in Eastern Europe, but you know, factories in China, in Vietnam, and in people's houses as well. You know, part of the reason the shoes we wear remain so cheap is because a lot of the assembly work is done by home workers. And what you see in the world of home working is things that belong in factories being put into people's houses. So industrial quantities of glue, you know, dangerous, flammable glue is suddenly in people's houses, you know, with their children, next to their cooker. It's extraordinarily dangerous.
When you talk about the home workers in your book, there's a small subchapter that's called "When Global Crisis Knocks," not hits, and you describe the global financial crisis of 2008 because, well, COVID had not yet happened when when this book has been printed. It actually started the moment where you had your book launch. You had to have it online. You actually had it here at Sands here in South London. So one thing you mentioned about when global crisis knocks, a different global crisis, was how home workers would be the first victims and how they would have a lot more problems. It sounds a bit like a prediction of this COVID situation. How has this impacted workers around the world, and especially home workers?
Yeah, well, it's been a catastrophe, basically. The COVID, like there is this expectation within the garment industry, within the textile industry, within the footwear industry, that the pain of any kind of crisis will be borne by the people at the bottom of the supply chain, and you know, that's what we've seen. Like, there was an awful report that came out from the Asia Floor Wage Alliance, where they talked about garment workers, footwear workers surviving the pandemic by engaging in their own mental and physical degradation. So what we saw was people basically mining their own bodies, like, in order to survive. And you know, we'd both done a lot of work covering the pandemic and its impact, and it's been awful. You know, you've had mothers driven to thinking that maybe they should kill their children. You know, like I've interviewed people who have lived on rice for like 6 weeks, taking their children out of school, becoming homeless, like endemic hunger across the industry. Like it's been awful. And at the same time, you know, the brands at the top of the industry have been making money. You know, they're richer now than they were at the start of the industry. You know, Jeff Bezos, like online shopping magnate, is now the richest man on the planet. So it's completely unequal. And yes, with home workers, you know, they are so sensitive to any shift in global trade. So it was apparent by January 2020 to home workers that something was happening. And in certain communities, like particularly in Tirupur in India, the work had gone by March 2020, dried up, nothing, you know, and this situation continued like for months on end. But I think it's also important to add that like a lot of these communities and the women in these communities became the backbone of those communities during the pandemic. So they were the people, you know, doing the mutual aid projects, like organising social distancing, organising food distribution, making sure that families in crisis were looked after. So it's not just like, you know, it's not like a story of victimhood. It's also like of like, you know, communities are having to come together to keep each other alive.
It's a story about people, about human beings.
Yeah.
Talking about seeing people as human beings, one of the most peculiar and beautiful in the same way chapters of your book is walking a mile in refugees' shoes, and you describe how well we all live in a global migration crisis, or whatever right-wing parties want to call it, and you talk about specifically refugees and how we should recall their fight as well. Why did you want to put this particularly in the book? Because the other chapters are very well clearly linked to the supply chain, and then I read that chapter and I was like, this is so interesting, but
no. Well, I'm really glad you liked the chapter, and I'm really glad you brought it up. I mean, I think like shoes, the story of shoes is the story of people, I believe. And the story of shoes is a story of movement and of migration. And as human beings, we've been wearing shoes for an estimated 40,000 years. And we started wearing shoes, and we still wear shoes, to enable us to move, you know, to enable us to migrate. To be able to deal with the rocks and the cold and the warmth and the snakes and, you know, the things on the ground. And so it was just really important for me to have that, a story that talked about a sense of movement, but that wasn't kind of academic, but that was also placed in this very political, very dangerous moment where we're not allowing people to move to safety. And I was particularly struck, you know, by the fact that shoes, like for export to Europe, are being made in Turkey by Syrian refugee children who are working in these basements. And they're making shoes, which once they're finished, will then go and cross the border, you know, into Germany, into England, into France, wherever. And yet the children that have made them are not free to cross that border. And so it just summed up for me the way we live in a world where objects are valued more than people. So it was really important to me to write that chapter and to think about shoes as as what they represent. So movement and migration and our journey as humanity, and this this crisis that we've put ourselves in at the moment.
So you mentioned that shoes are political, and already in the introduction, what you say, of course, there's reasons why we let our shoes be produced in Turkey, Macedonia, Far East, Vietnam, and so on. You mentioned that it's not just globalization, which is often called often given as the explanation to these well, the reason that these supply chains have moved so far away. You bring it back to colonialism, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think globalization is a really useful word. You know, it invented in, I think, 1983 to describe a new period in human history. But the pathways that globalization is treading were there before, and certainly with the shoe industry and the garment industry, the multinational corporations, when they purposefully choose where they want to manufacture, they are following colonial trade routes. That particular, here we are in Britain, like the colonial trade routes that this country a lot of the time put in place. There's a reason why British companies manufacture in Bangladesh and Pakistan and India and so on. So yeah, I think globalization is a useful word, but we have to see it in a wider political context.
One of your chapters is called Hell for Leather, and I recall that you don't particularly like shoes that bleed. I thought that was quite a cunning phrase. What is so wrong with leather, according to what you've seen and researched?
Oh man, I mean, so where to begin? The leather industry is a disaster. So it is a disaster for the planet. It is a disaster for human beings, and it is, of course, a disaster for animals. So if I just, I'll start with environment. So one thing that people don't often know is that the #1 cause of Amazon deforestation is cattle farming. So our shoes, are intrinsically linked with the destruction of the rainforest and with the climate crisis that we are all living through. We're also talking about the industrial slaughter of billions and billions of cows every single year. And, it remains my opinion that there is no ethical way to kill an animal that doesn't want to die. So as well as it being about the environmental impact of cattle farming, it's also, for me, about the cows as well, and living in a system where the death of billions of animals is taken for granted and just something that we should do. And then there's the social, the sort of human aspect of this. So I guess one of the most shocking bits of footwork is set in Bangladesh, and when I went there a couple of years ago, and there's you've probably seen it, the big river that runs through Dhaka, the Buriganja River. That river is black. Well, it was, when I visited there. It's black and it's dead. It's biologically dead as a river, and the reason it's dead is because of the tannery industry, where you have, you have chemicals that are so strong. I think as people watch this video, think about the chemicals that are tanning the leather are so strong that they can corrode the cars that are outside on the street. And these chemicals, including hexavalent chromium and all sorts of incredibly cancerous chemicals. And you have Bangladeshi tannery workers basically up to their necks a lot of the time in this really, really toxic soup, inhaling these these fumes and coming into contact with it in their skin. And out of this shocking chapter is the statistic that if you're a Bangladeshi tannery worker, you have a 90% chance of being dead by the age of 50, because of the chemicals that you're working with. So the leather industry is a complete nightmare. And a sustainable future does not include the leather industry as it looks now. We can't afford to chop down any more rainforest. We can't afford to kill any more rivers. It's it's a catastrophe.
Are there ways, in your opinion, of course, where leather or leather alternatives could be more sustainable?
Yeah, so I, in my work, I want to be clear, like I critique industrial capitalism. It is my belief that there are like communities, particularly sort of like First Nation communities, working with seal skin, working with caribou skin in, you know, in places like what's now called Canada, where that is done sustainably. So yes. But that aside, within industrial capitalism, of which that's not, you know, not a part, it doesn't want to be a part, the leather industry is not sustainable. I mean, the good news is that there's now loads and loads and loads of alternatives, and there's a really interesting page on the Better Shoes Foundation website where people can go and look at loads of different companies who are making shoes with like pineapple leather, Pinatex, mushroom leather, which is really nice, mushroom leather, you know, apple leather, you get recycled bottles, recycled tires, like cork, sustainably grown oak, like all kinds of things, recycled cotton, recycled denim. There's like a huge list, and it's not like, that's not the design side of shoes is not my area of expertise, but you know, we've come a long way from it being that, oh, leather's like the only thing we can use kind of thing. It's not anymore.
One thing that stood out, well, not just in this book in Footwork, but also in your previous book, which is called Stitched Up, the Anti-Capitalist Book of Fashion, is how you repeat that we cannot buy our way out of this problem. As you said, your critique is with industrial capitalism. So can you give some alternatives to buying more ethically? And if you were to give one specific call to action to all the people in this room, what would you recommend to them?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously have no problem with people making the most ethical decision that they can afford to make, and like, you know, good for you. If people want to do that, like, that's obviously great. And you know, and like doing swap shops and free shops and like you know, and secondhand, like all of that is like good. But yeah, you're right. Like we can't stop there. I think there is like there's a desire to think if we align our personal consumption habits with our ethics, that the world will somehow change. But it won't. It just won't. So we cannot stop there. And I think that's where we have to start thinking of ourselves not as consumers, but as citizens, you know, and as activists and as political beings who do have a say in the way the world is run. And I think one of the, like, in terms of the garment industry and the footwear industry, the good news is that there's already lots of groups who are doing this kind of work. So, you know, in Europe, you know, we have the Clean Clothes campaign, for example. Here we have War on Want and Labour Behind the Label. In America, you know, there's United Students Against Sweatshops. There's all kinds of things where people are doing kind of the hard, like, political work of challenging brands and challenging governments. Because what we've basically seen at the moment is like a huge rise in corporate power, but we don't have the legislation needed to stop them from basically doing like whatever they want. So yeah, I think you know, working intersectionally, educating yourself as much as possible by like reading and watching documentaries, working collectively with groups like within, you know, schools, colleges, places of worship, workplaces, you know, getting back out on the streets and holding protests and things, because you know, we have the headquarters in Europe, we have like the shops in Europe, and critically like supporting workers in the global south, like listening to them in terms of what they want in terms of how to be supported, you know. So that might mean like raising funds to support a group of striking workers. It might mean sort of pressurizing a brand or an embassy if workers are being like shot and killed or arrested, and you know, this kind of thing. Like there's basically an endless amount of stuff to do, let alone all the like environmental work that, you know, that organizations are starting to do. So yeah, I think you know, we've got to like change the world, not just our wardrobes.
Well, let's start doing that then. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me in the very place where you've written this book, most of it anyway.
Cool. I wish I was there in Ghent, but it's been brilliant to be here in London with you.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.